You know, scientific research is all about adapting. But what happens when something totally unexpected forces you to reinvent how you do things? So let's dive into a really cool story of how one team of researchers turned a huge challenge into a pretty unique opportunity. At the heart of all this is a question that, I think we've all wondered about at some point. How do kids develop that moral compass? What's going on in their heads when they have to decide whether to follow the rules, especially when they think no one's looking? Well, to try and answer this, a joint team from the University of Toronto and the University of British Columbia put together a study. They really wanted to dig into how kids make these kinds of moral decisions. So the big focus was on something called rule adherence. And really, that's just a way of saying they wanted to see when and why kids, from kindergarten all the way through elementary school, choose to follow the rules. And it's not just about, say, cheating on a game. It's much deeper. It's about getting a peek into how that little moral compass of theirs starts to develop. So the team had everything planned out. They were all set to run their study in a regulated lab. And then the pandemic hit. All of a sudden, bringing kids into the lab was just not an option. They had to pivot big time. The whole study had to move from the lab right into people's living rooms. And I really want to stress this. This was not just a small tweak. The team had to get super creative and basically transform their entire study to be delivered online, from home. Now, that came with some pretty big hurdles, for sure, but as we'll see, it also opened the door to some really interesting new possibilities. So their original plan was pretty complex. It was what researchers call a mixed methods approach, which basically just means they were collecting 3 different types of information to get the full picture. And of course, each one of those parts had to be cleverly adapted to work from home. Okay, so the first part, that was pretty straightforward. Parents just filled out questionnaires online. For the second part, they interviewed the kids. And they did something really smart here. They used these engaging online presentations, almost like a digital storybook, to talk through different moral scenarios. Super clever. But the third part, that was the tricky one. This was where they had to actually observe the child's behavior. And figuring out how to do that over a video call, that was the real challenge. And this right here is really the heart of the whole story, the most innovative part. Because as the researchers themselves said, watching what kids do, not just what they say they'll do, was the most challenging piece to move online. I mean, how do you see if a kid is following the rules when you're miles away looking through a webcam? So how did they pull it off? Let's walk through one of the specific tasks they designed. It was a balancing game, and its whole purpose was to create that little moment, that unwatched moment where a kid has to make a choice. Okay, so here's how it worked. A researcher gets on a Zoom call with a child and teaches them a simple balancing game. The rules were super clear. You have to balance on one foot, you can't let your other foot touch the floor, and you can't hold on to anything for support. All right, so once the rules are explained, the researcher says something like, oh, you know what, I need to go check on something really quick. I'll be right back. And then they'd leave the video call. But, and this is key, the call was still recording, which the parent had already agreed to, of course. Okay, the role of the parent here was absolutely crucial, and the team had a very specific protocol. First, the parent was told everything about the recording and gave their full consent. They even helped set up the camera so the researchers could see the child's whole body. But, and this is so important, the parent was not in the room while the child was playing the game. They also made sure the child was near something solid, just in case they needed to grab on for safety. So everything was safe, but it created that perfect condition for observation. And what did all this achieve? Well, it created a situation where the child really believed they were totally alone. And that's how they were able to see what really happens, to capture that natural, authentic behavior. Would they follow the rules to the letter? Or maybe put a toe down for just a second? So what came out of all this? This whole experiment was born out of necessity. But what did they learn from it? Well, it turns out that taking the research out of the lab and putting it into the home actually came with some pretty powerful benefits. For starters, by watching kids in their own familiar space, the behavior they saw was likely way more natural. Plus, think about it. The online setup made it so much easier for families to participate. No travel, no taking a whole afternoon off. And a fun little bonus, the kids actually seemed to find it really engaging. It's almost like the challenge forced them to create a method that, for this kind of research, might actually be better than the traditional lab, because it captures a more real slice of a kid's life. Now, you might be wondering about privacy and security, and of course, that was a huge priority. They made sure to use secure platforms, everything was password protected, and they had a really smart solution for parents who are worried about the video recordings being stored. The team would watch the video, log the data right away, and then delete the recording. Gone. It was a great way to respect everyone's privacy. You know, this whole story leaves us with a really big, thought-provoking question. These researchers didn't just save their study. By adapting like this, they kind of pioneered a whole new way of looking at behavior. It really makes you think. Maybe the best place to understand how we act isn't always in a lab, but right here, in the spaces where we live our lives. What else could we discover if we just looked a little closer to home? Thank you for listening.